The summer sun had settled heavy over the neighborhood, the kind of heat that made the pool the only place worth being. For years, residents of the subdivision had taken pride in the shimmering blue water, a carefully maintained oasis tucked behind a locked gate. It was not public property, and every homeowner knew the rules clearly. Only dues-paying residents were allowed inside. That was why the knock on my door one sweltering Saturday morning came as such an unpleasant surprise. Standing on my porch was Karen, the self-proclaimed watchdog of the HOA, arms crossed and posture stiff, as though she had been preparing for this moment all week. Karen wasn't on the official HOA board, but she carried herself as if she were its president, secretary, and treasurer rolled into one. She believed she was the neighborhood's moral compass, and anyone who crossed her quickly learned how far she was willing to go. Her demand was simple, at least in her mind. She wanted pool access, not for herself but for two guests who didn't live in the community. Outsiders. People who hadn't paid a dime toward the upkeep of the pool, or its insurance, or its security. I reminded her of the rules. That access was only for residents and their immediate families. But Karen didn't see rules as boundaries. She saw them as suggestions, bendable when they interfered with her desires. The refusal lit a fire under her. Her voice rose, sharp enough to draw curious eyes from across the street. She accused me of being unfair, of discriminating, of hoarding a community resource that was meant for everyone. I calmly held my ground, pointing out that she had failed to pay her own HOA dues for the past 2 months. That was a final insult. Her face flushed red. She stormed off without another word, but not before tossing one last threat over her shoulder. "You'll regret this." I didn't think much of it at first. Karen had a history of making dramatic statements she rarely followed through on. But an hour later, while I was in my backyard trimming hedges, the sound of sirens broke the air. I walked out to front just in time to see 2 police cruisers pulling into the neighborhood. And there was Karen, standing proudly by the curb with her arms raised like she had summoned them herself. She had called the cops. Over pool access. The officers approached, their faces already carrying that weary look of people forced into a situation they knew was unnecessary. Karen wasted no time spinning her tale. She painted me as a tyrant neighbor, someone who controlled the pool key like a dictator, denying her basic community rights. She exaggerated, twisted the story, and pointed to me as if I were the villain of the neighborhood. I could feel the eyes of the neighbors gathering, watching from their porches, enjoying the free drama show. Some were smirking. Others were shaking their heads, already familiar with Karen's antics. But what Karen didn't know was that I had been preparing for a confrontation like this for months. Because when you live under the constant shadow of someone who thrives on control, you learn to anticipate their next move. And while she thought she was about to humiliate me in front of the entire community, she was walking right into something she hadn't expected. The stage was set, the crowd was watching, and the cops were listening. Karen believed she had all the power, but in reality, she had no idea what I had waiting for her. The officer stood between us, shifting uncomfortably as Karen ranted. Her voice carried down the street, every word dripping with outrage and victimhood. She claimed I was abusing my authority, locking her and her friends out of what she insisted was public property. She even suggested I might be hiding something, embezzling HOA funds, mismanaging the pool, exploiting the neighborhood. To anyone who didn't know her, her performance might have been convincing, but the neighbors watching from their porches weren't new to her games. They had seen her pull stunt before, though never with police involved. This was a new level, even for her. The officers turned to me from my side. I stayed calm, almost quiet compared to Karen's theatrics. That contrast wasn't an accident. Where she was loud, I was measured. Where she was emotional, I was logical. And when I handed over the folder I had been keeping for months, the shift in the entire scene was instant. Inside the folder were copies of HOA records, minutes from meetings, official dues reports, copies of late payment notices. All neatly organized, all highlighting one fact. Karen was not in good standing with the HOA. She had ignored repeated letters about her unpaid dues. According to the bylaws, she wasn't even supposed to have pool access herself, let alone grant it to outsiders. The officers flipped through the documents while Karen's expression faltered. Her smug smile cracked when she realized the story wasn't going her way. She tried to interject to spin another narrative, but the paper trail was undeniable. Still, she refused to back down. Instead, she doubled down, insisting the HOA rules were unfair, outdated, and written by control freaks. She declared that as a long-term resident, she had rights beyond what was written. The cops, clearly growing tired, told her the issue was civil, not criminal, and that dragging them into it was a misuse of their time. That should have been the end of it. But Karen never knew when to stop. In her desperation to turn the tide, she made her biggest mistake yet. She accused me of changing locks and stealing HOA funds. These weren't just lies. They were serious allegations. Allegations that could backfire in ways she hadn't considered. Because what she didn't know was that I had been working quietly with the actual HOA board. For months, they had grown tired of her behavior too. The board had been preparing formal complaints and documenting her violations. Unpaid dues, harassment of neighbors, even misuse of common spaces. She thought she was exposing me, but she was actually walking into the very case being built against her. The officers, sensing they were out of their depth, suggested mediation and warned Karen not to make false accusations. But the damage was already done. Her credibility was crumbling in real time. Neighbors whispered from across the street, some recording on their phones, knowing this would spread like wildfire through the community's Facebook group. Karen stormed away, humiliated but not defeated. She wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. No, she would come back louder, angrier, and more reckless. And while the police may have left, the battle had only escalated. What Karen didn't realize was that I had been saving my strongest move for last. Something she could never have predicted. Something that would turn her crusade into her downfall. She thought she had won a round by dragging me into public conflict. In reality, she had just given me the perfect stage to reveal what I had been holding in reserve. The fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. And so the neighborhood reached its turning point. Karen, once loud enough to silence an entire block, now found her voice reduced to bitter whispers behind closed doors. Her call to the police had backfired, exposing her lies and her need for control. The HOA board had seen the evidence. The neighbors had seen the truth. And the mask she wore so tightly for years finally cracked in front of everyone. The pool, once her weapon to enforce imaginary authority, no longer carried her shadow. Children splashed freely. Families gathered without fear of harassment, and laughter replaced the tension she had cultivated for so long. For years, she had convinced herself that power came from intimidation, but in the end, real strength belonged to those who stood firm without aggression, those who refused to bow. As I walked past the water's edge that evening, the reflection staring back at me wasn't just my own. It was a calm of justice, the quiet victory of patience, and a reminder that truth doesn't always roar. It simply waits for the right moment to shine. Karen thought she could bend everyone to her will, but in trying to break me, she broke her own reputation instead. From that day on, life in the community shifted. Conversations were lighter, neighbors were friendlier, and even the board began to listen more closely to those they once ignored. Karen's downfall wasn't just about the pool. It was about freedom, about showing that no one person, no matter how loud, has the right to dominate others. And that was the real ending. Not the punishment she received, not the embarrassment she faced, but the peace that returned once her grip was gone. Because when you hold your ground and let people reveal themselves, justice doesn't need to be forced. It arrives on its own, quietly but powerfully, and leaves a mark that no one can erase. Do you think I was right to stand my ground against the HOA and Karen's false authority, or would you have handled it another way? Stories like this show how far some people will go control others, and why knowing your rights is so important. Share your thoughts. Was justice served here?